Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Angelica Spanos. We have a lot to get to today as we are following two live trials. One of those being a verdict that came in this morning. Now, this is in the trial of Kamaya Hassel in Michigan. Kamaya was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. And in Michigan, according to its law, that's an automatic sentence of life without parole. She will formally be sentenced on August 29th. We're also going to be following day 7 of the Rosenbaum's trial. Now, they are currently on a lunch break in that trial. We're monitoring that court feed, and we'll bring you there live when that starts up again. In the meantime, we want to play back some really important things we heard yesterday. This was the 911 call that the Rosenbaums made when they reported Layla to the police. That was the 911 call that the Rosenbaums made. Really, actually kind of hard to listen to now that we know so much about this, so much about the history with these foster children and the parents here. Joining me today to talk about all of this is Kirk Burkhalter, New York Law School professor, as well as Ann Bremner, trial attorney. Thanks for both of you for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Kirk, let's start with you. This 911 call, as I said, it's difficult to hear, especially now that we know all these details about this family and how poorly, frankly, they've treated this child.
Yeah, I would agree. It is difficult to hear. It'll be difficult for the jury to hear. I mean, at the very least, the parents did call 911 as opposed to not making a call. So if anything, certainly the defense can point to the factor that they, in some way, shape, or form, attempted to save the child. That would be their argument. And
Anne, what did you think about the call?
Well, I mean, I thought, well, she's a pretty good actress, too. I mean, she does sound panicked. She does sound worried and everything else. We know now there wasn't evidence of choking, but that's what she said happened. But she, I agree with Kirk that it's helpful for the defense. I mean, she did call 911. She did make efforts to save the child's life and get help right away. So that's going to be a score, at least on their side, this piece of evidence.
All right. And next up, we heard from the doctor who was in the hospital for Layla that day, and he points to a lot of red flags that he saw. Let's listen to him. So that, again, was Dr. Charles Evans. He's the emergency room physician who responded and, examined Layla when she got there. He talks about her having a complete tibia fracture on her right leg, which was not typical for a 2-year-old and not caused the way that the Rosenbaum said it was. He talked about a broken bone from blunt force trauma. And one of the things that was really stuck out to me here was how he said, over the 100,000 patients that he's seen in his experience, he has never seen something like this. So, Kirk, I mean, that detail, the way he said it, it really just grabs you.
Yes, and this is very important, and certainly the doctor is an expert witness. Injuries occur different ways, and based on the injury, one can kind of backwards engineer what occurred. There's indicia of some type of violent or traumatic act or some type of accident. So it's a matter. So he mentioned, if you look at these things one at a time, with the CPR, far be it for me to be a medical expert, but certainly from what I've seen with injuries in police work, the risk with CPR doing chest compressions is usually injury to the rib cage, not all over other areas of the body. Further, when someone falls, that's a very distinctive injury, even if it's a child. They're going to hit their one of their extremities, their head, their toe, not on their torso. So he pointed to that. The arm bowing, quite unfortunately, quite often, when someone is abusing a child, what do? They grab them by the arm, they hold them with the arm, and they use the other hand to strike them. And in doing so, you get these types of injuries to the arm. So this doctor who works in the emergency room has seen all types of injuries. He's a credible witness, and that's really just not helpful for the defense.
And anything you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree. And the thing I was thinking is, I was hoping that the prosecutor or anyone would ask whether or not he's seen a transected pancreas from the Heimlich maneuver application. Because that's very odd too. I keep thinking to myself, that might be 1 in a million. But 100,000 patients, and I love the word he used, which is diffuse, that these are the types of injuries, they're not consistent with what a child falling in the playground or things like that. And I would couple that as the prosecutor in closing with diffuse and then injuries that were inflicted over time. I mean, and just keep hitting on those themes about the kind of abuse this poor child suffered that led to her death.
Exactly. All right, we have one more clip from Dr. Charles Evans that we want to play for you. Let's listen. So more from Dr. Charles Evans. And this is just incredible to hear what he has to say. You know, he mentions how they call something that he saw a nightstick fracture, and that's because it's from a defensive posture. And that means that potentially this is a 2-year-old having to try to defend herself in that position from these parents. Is that what he's trying to say?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's a natural instinct to defend oneself. So just to go a little bit further, what he was saying, we talk about defensive wounds and other types of wounds. You know, there are many types of defensive wounds, but a classic one is one on the outer portion of your arms. What do you do when someone's attempting to strike you? You put your hands up, and that's a very natural instinct. The doctor is very credible here. He ordered, you know, he had these suspicions, and he ordered these tests right away. And certainly, I don't know if the question was asked, I'm assuming, and maybe asked, but how often does he order these tests after someone expires who's under his care? And I would assume not too often, especially with a child.
And especially knowing that he had an inkling that something may be up here. And what did you think about Dr. Charles Evans in this part? I mean, again, just really compelling.
Yeah, he's an excellent witness. I mean, he's very empathetic. He's very thoughtful. He's very careful. And when he put his arm up like that, you could just see the child doing that. And think about what kind of force that one time was used to cause that injury. And then you think about multitude of times that she was abused.
And especially him talking about the defense part of that, because I don't know if we really had our minds thinking of that so far. I mean, obviously we knew this child was allegedly being abused, but my brain hadn't gone to the defense part of this because, again, this is just a young child.
Well, exactly. And that's why it's just so stunning to think that she'd have to do that, and she'd have to learn how to do that. And, you know, it's just the visual, I mean, it's going to stay with that jury. It's certainly going to stay with me. When I saw that, I just went, oh, my gosh, you know, what a terrible, terrible thing for that child. The way she perished, but the way she lived.
All right, so a quick update with this trial. Before we talk about Officer Harrison, I'm told right now that one of the jurors, they are still on a break, but one of the jurors speaking to the judge, defense, and prosecution right now and is asking to be excused to go to the dentist because of a toothache. So they're trying to figure out how if it will affect this trial and everything going forward. So we will obviously keep you posted on that. In the meantime, let's talk about Dwayne Harrison. Again, this is the police officer who responded in the hospital after the report of a suspicious death. One of the things that I thought was interesting that one of the first things they asked him is the demeanor of the Rosenbaums here. He asked them if they were crying, Kirk, and their answer was he didn't see it.
Didn't see it, and just amazing. It's very interesting that the prosecutor asked that question first, because just as someone who's listening to this testimony, once I heard that answer, that was kind of burned in my mind as I heard all the other answers. So I'm assuming that was something strategic on the part of the prosecutor, so that was very interesting. The police officer, in this case the sergeant who responds at the scene of a possible homicide or suspicious death, has an awesome responsibility. He's there to safeguard evidence, to question possible witnesses and so forth before they leave. And this is what he did. So he asked what happened. And what seems to be interesting was the first part of the responses seemed like responses that would come from someone who's familiar with CPR, children of a certain age, rather than doing certain types of compressions on a Heimlich. You might turn them over and hit them on the back. But then afterwards, seem to go off the beaten path. We hear about these disturbing facts, the butter knife, then dropping her on the floor because she was kicking and so forth. So the two stories seem a little disjointed.
Yeah, the dropping her on the floor is really interesting because even if you don't exactly know what you're doing, I mean, it seems bizarre to say you were dropping a child 2-3 feet off of something. And what stuck out to you from Sergeant Harrison?
You know, all of those things, and the fact that maybe she was trying to explain the kind of injuries that the ER doc saw, you know, that dropped her on the floor, you know, hit her in the back, etc. I thought he was an excellent witness, and I thought that the way he described what she said she did basically put a nail in her coffin in terms of a conviction, because none of it made sense. She's trying to explain away injuries, but yet he's very dispassionate, very credible, and very interesting testimony that's very damaging to the defense, and especially starting with that lack of demeanor. And then he actually threw them a bone, so to speak, by saying, well, they weren't crying, but they had already learned, that their child had died, their foster child had died, kind of trying to be as even as he can be.
Yeah, that was interesting. All right, well, they go on to cross-examine Sergeant Dwayne Harrison, so let's listen to that. Okay, again, so that was the cross-examination. I don't necessarily know if that really did much here. Kirk, I mean, what do you think?
Well, the defense is doing their job, so
Right.
they have to question this. And, she started off by saying everyone reacts to death differently, which is very, very true. That being said, my son is 30. I still tear up when I think whenever he was 3 years old and he skinned his knee, right? So everybody reacts to death differently, but most of us tend to react a certain way. So I don't know how helpful that was. And she just pretty much went through the testimony, what he said he heard. What was interesting was she only said she said a couple of times. So she kind of say, well, she did this, she did that, she did that, as opposed to preceding every sentence saying she said X, she said Y, she said so-and-so.
And to kind of look at this from the other side, when we said, the first question we heard was that the Rosenbaums didn't really react that well. They were not crying, and it was because they had already knew of this. It wasn't their immediate reaction. They had already learned of this. And in the converse, I mean, is that, and then going off of what she said, everyone reacts to death differently. Does that kind of piece this together maybe for the defense a little bit?
Yeah, I think a little bit, and maybe to emphasize again that they had already learned about their child's death. I frankly, I think on a cross on this, if I were the defense attorney, I might not even do a cross and save some of these arguments for closing. You can argue that in closing. People react differently to death, things like that. But unless I can't thinking, finally, is she basically admitting that her client said all these things to him? Is the client not saying, I didn't say that, I didn't do that, et cetera? I mean, I don't know. We'll wait and see. But sometimes no cross-examination is the best cross-examination.
All right, Ann, thank you. We're going to take a quick break here on Law and Crime. When we come back, we'll continue to follow this trial and plenty more. Stay with us.